Hello and welcome back to The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here with retired Navy captain and current gentleman, Carl Schuster. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And again, we're going to talk about the military in the world, and military, as a military historian. He's been on the show several times now. And today we're going to talk about China's Navy. So why did you want to talk about China's Navy?
Well, they've been getting a very visible global profile, particularly in the last few months. Largely because of their involvement in anti-piracy operations in the Indian Ocean, but more recently because of China asserting its claims very aggressively in the South China Sea. And so people have now begun to look at the People's Liberation Army Navy, as they call it, they're the Chinese Navy, as if it was a new thing, when in fact they have been building up now for close to 30 years. And it's been a very slow and incremental process, but also a pretty aggressive one within that.
So to give us some perspective, how do they compare to our Navy?
Well, they're about 60% of our Navy in terms of number of ocean-going units. In terms of combat power, they're about 10 years behind us right now. But they're investing very heavily in catching up. The last round of ships they're building, their guided missile destroyers, for example, have capabilities that our Aegis-class units acquired just before the turn of the century. And so they've gone from being 50 years behind us in 1980 to within a decade of us now.
So can you tell us a little bit statistically, what they have, and kind of how they built up to this point?
Oh, indeed. Well, originally, from 1949 to about 1980, they were purely a coastal defense force. They had about 4,000 units, over 1,200 of which were these little coastal missile patrol boats, and some coastal anti-submarine warfare ships. They had about 30 traditional combatants, as we would consider them. They rarely went to sea, and they rarely operated more than 90 miles off their coast. And so they were purely coastal defense force designed to prevent an enemy from landing on the beach under their People's War Doctrine. The People's War Doctrine, which was authored by Mao, was based on their experiences in World War II and the Civil War, where they were fighting an aggressor on their own territory. The Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 exposed some of the weaknesses of that doctrine when you're fighting someone at the border and beyond. And so from 1980 on, they've been developing a doctrine of what they call regional wars under conditions of high technology. In other words, greater distance, more rapid evolution of the battlefield, more rapid decision-making, and greater distances and complexity in the operations themselves. And so the navies had kind of slowly built up to become a part of that.
So let's break it down a little bit to different categories. So let's start with the technology. Where did they start in you said the last 30 years, so the 80s, and where are they now?
Okay, in 1980, they had entirely obsolete units. Most of their ships were 1950s technology. Their weapons were World War II era weapons. Their sensors were immediate post-war weapons. The hull designs were obsolete. They weren't very good in open ocean. Their submarines were all copies of Soviet post-World War II designs, which were themselves copies of German World War II designs. And so they had mostly coastal submarines that had obsolete propulsion systems, obsolete sensors. They weren't capable of going far from shore. They were slow underwater and noisy, even though they were conventional. They tried building some nuclear-powered submarines in the 70s. But mostly it was a failure. The plants were not only noisy, they were unsafe, and they were unreliable. And so what you had was a fleet that couldn't go far and couldn't do much when it got there. And the air arm, the Navy's Air Force, consisted of planes that were designed in the late 1950s. And so they were 25 years behind the oldest aircraft in the American inventory. And overall, they were about 50 years behind us. For example, in electronic warfare, they had almost nothing. And what they had was Korean War era. Now, today, it's a different story. Beginning in the mid-'80s, they acquired foreign technology, some of it from Western Europe, some of it from the old Soviet Union. They bought 4 guided missile destroyers from the Soviet Union that were 2 generations ahead of the ships built in China. They also got these Kilo-class conventional submarines that were also a quantum leap ahead of what China was building themselves. And so the 1980s saw them acquiring foreign technology, studying it, learning how to use it, and in some cases reverse engineering it. Most people consider that a derogatory way of doing things or primitive. But during the Cultural Revolution, most of China's engineers and scientists either disappeared, defected, or were taken out into the countryside and their research facilities destroyed.
So do you think that brain drain has had an effect on their ability to develop a
It did.
high-tech military?
It did, and that's part of the reason they had to play catch-up. Once they instituted the reforms in the 1980s, one of the things they did was they sent students overseas, and they invited corporations and research institutes to do work in China. The idea was to build a core of scientists and researchers and engineers who could then, by building on what they learned overseas, bring a Chinese aspect to the new technologies they would build for China. And to a great extent, they are at least nearing achievement of that. They still have a weakness in propulsion systems, both for ships and airplanes. But their avionics, for example, are more advanced than you find in Russia. So even when they buy a Russian aircraft, they put their own electronics in it now. Their computer industry is 2 generations ahead of Russia. All this is because of the commercial investment they invited and the massive educational effort they did to develop a human technological base as well as an
industrial. You see this in
one.
China's nuclear industry as well, which
Yes,
is
ma'am.
now I think they are building the most new nuclear power plants. I'm not sure if they're right now, but I know they will be in the very near future, the largest source of nuclear power in the world.
Indeed. They have 32 nuclear plants under construction now. The other thing, too, is they just signed a $64 billion agreement with Britain to partner with their nuclear power industry to build power plants in Britain and also alternate energy facilities, a $6 billion investment in biomass research and production.
And what's interesting about what they have done in the nuclear industry is they started with, they built a few Chinese power plants, but they've invited countries from all over the world, including France, Areva, U.S. Westinghouse, and Russia's nuclear power company to come build nuclear power plants in their country and to bid on different spots. And from this, they are able to see the different technologies in the 3rd generation and even now starting 4th generation of nuclear power plants.
Plus, they put 14,000 students overseas to study nuclear physics, and things of that nature, and they're heavily involved in the multinational fusion research center in France. In fact, they're funding 40% of it. So they've come a long ways in the last 30 years, and it's because they've essentially mobilized the nation to make that technological advance.
Right, versus the United States where, we have such a brain drain of scientists and engineers because so many of 50% of engineering degrees in our country are given to foreign students, but then we're not giving them green cards. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we could go down. Let's get back to the PLN.
And we've forgotten that most of our innovation in the space program and other industries in the 50s were foreign engineers and scientists coming to the United States. Immigration helped us immensely in the 50s. China is, of course, taking a slightly different view, but at the same time, when you look at how far they've gone ahead, it's clearly a national effort. Now, most of it was focused on the economy. The 2 primary elements of their military doctrine are defense of the Communist Party and enhancement of the economy. So much of what their military has done and the pace of their military development has been done in a way to enhance their economy as well as their military power.
So I think it's important we point out a few things with that. The first being this is a very inward-looking military.
Yes, ma'am.
They are not
not anymore.
They are not looking as the United States has done in the past, as a great power, and Britain, to patrol areas outside of their sphere of influence. They're not as much.
Indeed, they're just getting into that.
They're just starting.
We'll talk about that later.
And the second thing is the People's Liberation Army or Navy are part of the Communist Party. They are not the military of the government itself. So the first and foremost piece of their doctrine is to protect the Communist Party. And this can even be against internal disturbances.
Oh, indeed. The People's Armed Police, which is the largest single element of their military force structure, is totally focused on internal security. The other parts of the military are being reduced in size, but the People's Armed Police actually has expanded over the last 10 years. They're nearly 2.5 million people, and they are almost completely focused on internal security. You'll find a major presence, for example, in Xinjiang and Tibet, where they face what they consider to be separatist movements. In the case of Xinjiang province, a terrorist movement. For the Navy, however, the Navy initially was focused on simply extending the defensive umbrella. It's the reality of their economy that has led them to look at other things. For example, the Navy's been tasked to provide defense in depth. And how do you do that without extending your operations? But they didn't suddenly leap and do a massive fleet program. What they did was they slowly and incrementally did it, studied the lessons learned, developed the mission requirements, then pursued the technology to facilitate that, and then pursued the industrial development to provide an indigenous component to providing that. And so that is number one. They rejected the sort of things the American Navy and British Navy did until about 8 years ago. So if we could, throw up the first map. It shows the first and second island chain. Under their doctrine, beginning in about 2008, these are the two areas of ocean and airspace that they feel are important to their defense. The first island chain, which if you see that kind of almost like a shepherd's hook at the bottom, wraps around their claimed territorial waters in the South China Sea. The Navy is tasked with maintaining control of and dominating the air and sea space of the first island chain by 2015, which is this year. Now, I'm one who doesn't think they've achieved it, but they take it very seriously. And then by 2030, they hope to be able to at least deny the waters out to the second island chain to a hostile entity. Now, although it's not on this map, on the far edge of the second island chain is the island of Guam. So the boundary for the second island chain is the U.S. territory of Guam. And so they're slowly expanding their areas of concern and control and operations.
So let me ask you a few questions about
Sure.
this. First being, can you compare this to U.S. territorial waters and what we view? So, for example, in the Caribbean.
Yeah, we claim 12 nautical miles.
Okay.
We do claim a 200 nautical mile economic exclusion zone, but we do not consider that our territorial waters. We consider that an area of patrol for environmental purposes and also to intercept illegal activities, which both traditional international law and the UN Convention Law C allows. Where the Chinese differ from us, and they're not the only country that does, the Chinese are using the tenets of international law that state that if you are enforcing domestic regulations over a territory, whether it's maritime or land, then that is an act of sovereignty, and therefore that water is your territorial waters. They claim, dating back to ancient times, that the South China Sea was always theirs. The problem with that argument is that the Manchu dynasty did not enforce those claims or make those claims. Even when the Europeans came, they didn't object to the Europeans going there. The Ming were the last to contest those waters or to garrison them or patrol in them.
Well, for the British have Hong Kong and the Portuguese have Macau.
Indeed, but that came in the 18th and 19th century. When the Europeans first showed up in the 15th, the Manchus weren't prohibited. They prohibited their people from conducting foreign trade, and they had dismantled their navy. And so even the fishing fleets in those waters in that era were from Vietnam or the Philippines, the various tribal kingdoms of the Philippines, or the sultanates of what is now Malaysia and Indonesia. And so under international law, a claim you do not make is a claim that's lost. The claim they're currently enforcing first surfaced in international forums in 1947 by the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese. And the mainland Chinese or communist Chinese simply have inherited it and done the historical research to provide what they believe to be a foundation.
Okay, so a few more questions. You're speaking about Taiwan and the Chinese nationalists. So does China claim the territorial waters around Taiwan? Well, it does, clearly.
That's correct,
It claims
yes.
Taiwan. So does it prevent trade or any shipping that happens in there?
Not yet.
And what are their capabilities to do that?
Well, it depends. If Taiwan were, they could, I think, institute at least a constriction on Taiwanese trade. The thing that would prevent them from being able to do a total blockade is, do they have the air power to protect the ships conducting the blockade? Any blockade they would do of Taiwan, I think, they would have to do from a great distance outside Taiwanese air power. But if you close the South China Sea, there's very little Taiwan can do about it, and that would effectively be a chokehold on both not only Taiwanese trade, but Japanese trade and South Korean trade. So it would be more of a quarantine than a blockade. They would be stopping ships to find out if they were en route to Taiwan and checking their cargo and all that. And that assumes China would be the only country operating in those waters.
That's a great place to stop for a break.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Again, this is Hillary Weinberg, and this is The Whole Gamut. We are on Twitter at ThinkTechHI. See you soon.
Indeed. Now, when we open up...
ThinkTech also believes in the arts. Yes, we do energy and tech and diversification and globalism, but we believe that a great state deserves great arts. And we have a program coming up on October 27th at the Anthology Theater in Pauahi Tower, Bishop Square, a downtown forum, if you will, called Hawaii, the State of the Arts. It's a double entendre. And the tagline on that is inspiration for everyone, because everyone needs to enjoy the arts, benefit by the arts, be involved in the arts, participate in the arts, be an artist, if you will. And the inquiry is into how we can make the arts great in Hawaii, how we can achieve excellence, how we can make them survive and prosper here. We have 7 people on our panel. We have Jonathan Parrish, the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra, Simon Crookall from Hawaii Opera Theater, Dina Dre from Diamond Head Theater. We have Pamela Taylor-Tong from Ballet Hawaii, Stephen Yost from the Hawaii Museum of Art. We have Yukio Ozaki from Chaminade University. He's a potter and a sculptor there. We have Gerard Elmore from ACM, the Academy for Creative Media, but also he's a filmmaker. With these people, we're going to examine not only how each one of these different disciplines work, but how they relate to each other and they collaborate with each other, how they reach out into the community and overseas to the mainland and to Asia. This is going to be a program we're going to find out what excellence we have, what excellence we want, and how we can make the arts and the collaboration of the arts survive and prosper in Hawaii. Come down. You want to sign up? It's thinktechhawaii.com. We'll see you there.
Welcome back to The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here with retired Navy Captain and military historian Carl Schuster. We are talking about China's Navy. And when we left at the break, we were talking about China's military doctrine, and we had just talked about China's technology. But now let's combine the two. And where do they meet, and what's happening?
Well, if we could open up with the DF-21D map that shows the missile ranges. Their doctrine within the first island chain in particular, but ultimately in the second island chain as well, is what's known as an area and sea denial doctrine. The idea is to prevent a hostile force from entering those waters and getting within strike range of China itself. The DF-21D is an anti-ship ballistic missile. As you can see, it can reach almost all the way out to the second island chain. And it has a kind of a deceptive flight path, which makes it hard to engage, not impossible. And the idea here is any major platform, like an aircraft carrier that comes within strike range, if the decision is made to take it out, then this is the first weapon system they would choose. I'm one who thinks they wouldn't use it by itself, but it's their option, depending on how their tactics and operational procedures work.
And does the U.S. have comparable technology?
Yeah,
other
our
countries in the
Aegis
region?
class ships can shoot that down. And so it complicates our naval operations because you're within the engagement window the moment you approach the first island chain. When you're in that area between the first and second island chain, if there is a conflict ongoing or tensions are high, you cannot ignore the possibility of the conflict being launched by that missile, or it being the opening shot, if you will.
Okay, so now that we kind of have, an understanding of the basics of the Navy, where are they going and what's their plans looking out?
Well, like all militaries, they have to balance the most critical national security problem against the most likely. One of the things that has been driving them over the last 8 years is one I don't think they considered in the 1980s, and that is the need to protect trade. Their economy has seen phenomenal economic growth since around 1984. And it's an export-driven economy that's growing at about 12, 14% a year up until the last decade. Last 5 or 6 years, it's slowed down significantly. But that has done two things. That draws a need for raw materials to feed your factories and services and also to build your infrastructure. There was a while when China was importing 87% of all the world's cement production.
What is that number now? 'Cause I know the cement industry
It's
is
down
quite
around
large.
55.
We have to remember that's also very energy intensive.
Indeed. And their energy imports
Industry.
have also grown. And so what happens is their export markets grew beyond the west coast of the United States to Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and so on. You've got your ships moving through waters that are under the protection of someone else. And when piracy suddenly became a problem, and China now a major player in the global economy, pirates intercepting their ships and damaging their ships, they began to increase their participation in UN operations in 1999 so that they would have a say, and a growing say, UN operations in areas of concern to them outside their immediate region. But you also saw the Navy looking at problems. For example, and that drove them to have to expand. For example, commensurate with this sudden recognition of a growing need, you also need an industrial base to do it. And so China did two things. They invested heavily in their shipbuilding industry. If you think back, for example, in 1970, China's shipbuilding industry was very limited in capacity, and what little they built was horribly obsolete. Well, that's changed. By the 1990s, they were investing billions, not only in the shipbuilding industry, but in all the supporting industries around it, electronic, propulsion, steel fabrication, etc. And so today, it has the largest and possibly the most advanced commercial shipbuilding industry in the world.
Now I want to quickly tie this to a show I did a few weeks ago with Jay Fidel, and we talked about the Jones Act
Yes,
and
ma'am.
the U.S. shipbuilding industry, how that is completely obsolete, completely destroyed, and merchant marine. So the Jones Act prevents us from shipping with foreign ships in between our own ports. But China is clearly going above and beyond what our capabilities are in this industry.
Indeed. And the Jones Act has both positive and negative effects to it. The thing to remember, most attacks on the Jones Act says it makes our merchant marine uncompetitive, when in fact, if we didn't have the Jones Act, most of our merchant marine would disappear. And the reason is we can't build ships as cheaply as China. China's using the mass production techniques we developed in World War II, but they pay their shipyard workers less than 20% of what we pay ours. And so when you add the two together, you wind up with a ship that can be built for about 40% of the cost. Our shipyards are actually fairly efficient. If you ever deal with a ship built in Bath Iron Works in Maine, for example, they build their ships to perfection. I have never had a fault on any ship I've served on built by Bath Iron Works. They come out of the yards, the sea trials are almost just a pro forma.
Right. And how long were you in the U.S. Navy for?
29 years.
29 years. So that's, and have you, all the U.S. Navy ships are built in the United States?
Oh yeah, have to be. All our warships are. And all our support ships, submarines, etc. And we have a requirement for a percentage of our merchant marine to be able to support the military. The things that make you an efficient merchant ship work against you when you're being used for military purposes. For example, a container ship's not very practical in
Right.
in an amphibious operation or in a military operation, but it's very efficient for moving just raw cargo. Mostly roll-on ships and what's known as general cargo ships, dry bulk carriers. And so we have the Maritime Security Act, which provides subsidies for shipyards to build ships to some military standards. And we have the Jones Act, which limits U.S. flag ships, limits our intra-part trade to U.S. flagships. That's not entirely a bad thing, and we're not the only country that does that. China, for example, doesn't allow foreign ships to haul cargo between its ports.
It's a security issue as well.
Exactly, it is. I mean, I read somewhere, somebody wrote a study and said, well, if we let a foreign crewman man our rivercraft and our coastal shipping, it would cut our shipping costs in half, and that's a true statement. But the example they used was Libya. Picture a dozen jihadists on a fuel barge on the Mississippi River with 10,000 tons of fuel or toxic chemicals or explosives, and suddenly deciding, what the hell, let me take out St. Louis.
So pre-1929, was that the merchant?
Pre-1920, yeah.
1920, were there foreign vessels on our rivers and going between our ports?
Not really. There were some, mostly from Latin American countries.
Yeah, because I'm like, thinking like the era of, Erie Canal and Panama Canal.
Oh, in those days, purely American.
Yeah, I mean, the
Purely
Mississippi
American.
River.
But we did have foreign ships go as far as Vicksburg.
Where's that?
It's in Mississippi.
Okay.
I'm not sure why anybody would want to go to Mississippi, but they did. In those days, of course, we were hauling cotton mostly. But for the most part, those were very rare. Those were ships from Latin America who picked up their cargo in Vicksburg and then went down to Venezuela and brought cargo to New Orleans or Vicksburg, whatever. You didn't see like British or French or any of the major oceanic trading countries going up the river, any of our rivers. The Jones Act was so when if we ever went to war again, we would not have to worry about suddenly building merchant ships or relying on ships. But that's a separate discussion. Most people that attack the Jones Act point out that in Desert Storm, 22% of the cargo was hauled in foreign ships, and that is a true statement. But they were foreign ships of countries participating in the war against Saddam Hussein. So they were allied in the fight. They weren't hauling our cargo out of altruistic reasons. In Vietnam, we had many foreign flagships refuse to carry cargoes to Vietnam, and it delayed some of our activities in Vietnam. We had to transload the cargoes to American ships.
Now, another question I want to ask is, how does China's Navy compare to historically advanced navies, historically powerful navies? So, like, we're looking at, British, French. I'm also thinking Turkish, because I know the Turks have one of the largest navies in the world.
They compare very favorably with the U.S. Navy in the 1890s.
Okay.
Prior to 1890, our Navy was small and obsolete, and little more than an archaic coastal defense force with some limited ocean-going capability. By 1898, on the other hand, we were an ocean-going fleet, and the Brits were very worried about us. Most European countries were worried about what we would do next. We think we liberated the Philippines, Cuba, and so on. But if you read the archives of the navies of Germany, France, and Britain, they looked at us, okay, they've taken Spain's colonies, or ours next.
Wow. That's a perspective that you don't hear. I mean, we have such a U.S.-centric view of American history. That's what we're taught in our schools, that we don't really talk about those different perspectives. But unfortunately, we have to cut to a break, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
We are on Twitter at ThinkTechHI. Please send us questions, comments, anything that you would like to have us talk about on the show. It's your chance right now. See you soon.
Aloha, I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I host Sustainable Hawaii every Tuesday from 11 a.m. to 12 noon. My guests offer insights on challenging economic and environmental issues facing our state and offer innovative solutions to increasing Hawaii's long-term sustainability. Recently, we've been focusing on sustainable land development, food, and energy security. If you have a project or issue you'd like to discuss on the show or would like to be a guest, please contact me at kirstenbturner@gmail.com. And tune in live weekly or view the show at your convenience at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.
Maritime dependent.
Hi. Welcome back. This is The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg. You caught us just in the middle of our planning session for the rest of this, and we're going to have to end up doing a part 2 because there's so much to talk about, and this is such an important, expansive topic that we really want to take the time to get into in depth. But we're going to go back and start again talking about China's merchant marines and the status of their ships, their shipbuilding industry, and their sailors and their marine, and everything that's happening with that.
Indeed, if we flip up the merchant fleet chart, in 1970, sorry, the previous one. There we go. They went from 6 ships on the ocean seas in 1970 to nearly 4,000 today. And that doesn't count the Hong Kong flag ships. There are nearly 4 times as many ships under Hong Kong registry, which, as you know, is a part of China now. They used to be a separate registry under British protection. Now they're under Chinese. And if you look at that little bitty red block, that'll give you an idea of what's happened to our merchant marine in the same time period.
You know, that's something I didn't even consider, that Hong Kong, Britain, which was, historically the largest, most advanced fleet, and then now China is the future.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Hong Kong's right in the middle. It's bridging those gaps.
Absolutely. And what you're looking at here is their economic expansion has been both a blessing and a curse. You see this growth of the merchant marine. The beauty of it is most of the cargoes are hauled in Chinese or Hong Kong ships, which means the profits are repatriated back to China. The wages are repatriated back to China in the case of Chinese ships. Most of Hong Kong ships are manned by Filipinos.
Huh.
People from the Philippines constitute about 60% of the world's merchant sailors. And that's a good source of income for the Philippines, but that's a separate story. And then what I'd like to do, if I can, with the next slide, is China's economy is now maritime dependent. Now what I've done here, they're the world's second largest oil importer. What this map shows you is the very diverse range of sources that China has and how far those energy sources have to move. And you'll notice the choke point in the Malacca Straits.
Right.
You will also notice the area where the Indian Ocean there between India and the Middle East, that's where the pirates were attacking their ships. And so their Navy's very active in that area and off the coast of Somalia.
No, to go back to the point we were making earlier, the Malacca Strait is manned by U.S. ships and Indonesian ships and ships from Singapore, not by Chinese ships. And the Chinese rely very, very heavily on that strait. And they've done a lot of, they've built an entire pipeline to surpass that. That's a whole other story.
Yes, ma'am.
That we could get into.
And what we'll go into next time is I'll show you who they exercise and train with bilaterally. And you'll find a focus on that region of the world for their training and bilateral activities. So the Navy is an extension of national power, but China has learned and is now getting into what we euphemistically refer to as soft power. The diplomatic side of naval operations is becoming increasingly important, and that's pushing them further and further out from China.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happening inland, just so we can kind of give a good understanding of why it's so important that they have this powerful naval force. When you look at the countries that it is possible to trade with, they are having discussions with Central Asian countries about Silk Road, building a new Silk Road, quote unquote, where they're trying to expand their trade through those countries. They're building, trains, from Turkey to China. They're also looking at Russia. And Russia, they're building, train systems and roads and all these things connecting those countries. But you look at the economies of those countries, they are very resource dependent on energy. The Central Asian nations and Russia. And of course, they're all almost exclusively former Soviet Union countries. And some of them included in that category are countries with very big problems with terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism. When you look at the Turkic nations, Islamic fundamentalism is becoming a big problem. There's a lot of problems between those countries. Azerbaijan and Turkey have a lot of problems. Azerbaijan and Armenia have a lot of problems, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that's just those 3 countries right there. That's very long historical precedence of difficulties. There's historical precedence of trade and difficulties between those powers. So building up those trade routes over land because China is so geographically isolated. I mean, if you look at the maps of China, majority of its trade, I think over 80% of its economy is based on the eastern coast.
That's correct.
Inland is deserts and mountains. I mean, you can't do anything with that. I mean, they're not, there's very little trade. I mean,
well, that's why they're developing both the pipelines you see there, and of course the quote new Silk Road goes all the way to Spain.
Right. Wow.
But they're also putting their merchant ships slowly in an exploratory fashion through the Arctic Ocean. They've had 2 ships go through there in the last 18 months.
Global warming.
What's known as the Northeastern Passage. But the other thing they're doing in those countries, which sounds rather strange when you first encounter it, when they were building the pipeline through Pakistan, the Baluchi tribesmen were attacking their engineers. And so what the Chinese did was they went out and met with the tribal leaders. Okay, what can we do with this pipeline that would make it a benefit to you? And, one tribesman wanted ice cream, so they built a string of ice cream factories along the pipeline route. Another
That's
one was
a great story.
Yeah, another one was interested in education, so they built schools and clinics, and they send the children of these tribal leaders to China for education.
You have to remember that China does not have historical precedents of going out and colonizing. They like to have secure their power. They have their historical and traditional spheres of influence, but they don't really, really go out and try and take over the nations. I mean, they were in charge of Vietnam for a very long time, but they didn't do what the British Empire did in India, where they, had their citizens move there and had, British schools and became very involved in the government. They just kind of wanted it for the resources and the monetary, to help Greater China. So it's very different. This is new. This is all new territory.
Yeah, but remember now, they've been in Central Asia off and on since the 7th century AD. And so they understand the complexities. That place can become chaotic in a hurry. And so they've kind of hedged their bets. We were in the ironic position of protecting some of their investments in Afghanistan when we had a major troop presence there. And once again, they do a two-front approach, if you will. They establish relationships with clan leaders and tribal leaders, and they'll tell them up front, we're not here to change your culture. What we want is a business transaction. The Brits went wrong in Afghanistan when they stopped paying the local tribes for transit routes to their territory. That's what triggered the first Afghan war. Well, the Chinese have learned from that. They suffered a major defeat in Central Asia when they decided to ignore the local customs. And so, they have a sense of history. So they treat Central Asia different from Africa. In Africa, they're having problems because their citizens show up, build and run the factory, and there's no opportunity for the locals. The elites are happy because they're getting fees. They're going to have to deal with that in 5 or 10 years' time. They've had to evacuate their people from some of the African countries because of unrest. They've had to evacuate Yemen twice. That's driven the Navy to worry about some of that. But in Central Asia, they're basically doing it fairly right so far. Find out who the power is for that particular piece of territory you have to go through. Find out what they want, make an accommodation. But at the same time, don't interfere with the mechanisms of the main government. Their position that they will not interfere with the internal sovereignty of a country is very attractive to all these countries' leaders and elites.
It is, because the United States, we come in, we're the city on the hill, we will come and reform you and bring you to light, whether it was the missionaries in Africa bringing religion and trying to, quote, enlighten the people, or it's, trying to bring now democracy to other countries, and how successful is it? And there's a lot of, huge debates about this. I mean, we can go on and on and on about this topic.
Absolutely.
But the most interesting place I've seen this is Afghanistan, which you touched upon, which is known as colloquially the graveyard of empires. So, the Russians were in there, the British were in there. Now the U.S. has, been bled financially to be, to be in Afghanistan, and the country. And now China has significant interest in this country, and. Another point I would like to touch upon quickly is India, which is another large power, one of the rising powers, one of the largest countries in the world, which is a democracy, which is another country that we should, keep our eye on and hopefully talk about at a later date.
Indeed, we can do that because they're responding to the Chinese naval buildup and to the Chinese investment in Africa and diplomatic act. In fact, they're competing with China in Africa now. and they're just looking at competing with them in Central Asia and Afghanistan, much to Pakistan's chagrin.
So, China is trying to build these overland routes. It understands that they are risky. It's hedging its bets. It's providing, options and opportunities for itself, so it can continue to expand. But it is really relying on these sea routes. It does not have the luxury of the United States of having 2 coasts or 3 coasts. I mean, our coast goes almost all the way around our country. It does not have the luxury of, established infrastructure and networks. There's a lot of desert and, dead space where there's not, where it's just villages and there's not a lot of industry and economy. And you have the Himalayas on one side, you have the Gobi Desert. So it has a lot of barriers.
And they're investing heavily in, they're going to build 300 airfields over the next 10 years. And they're talking about whether they'll do it or not remains to be seen, building a canal that will connect southwest China to the Irrawaddy River in Burma, or hook it up to the Mekong. That's going to be, if it ever becomes, it'd be incredibly expensive and difficult. But if they're serious about it, they hope that will bring investment and opportunity to that part of China, so they won't have to worry about a concentration of public services in the East Coast. Because right now, you go within 50, 60 clicks of the coast, that's where 80% of their economic activity is. And public services are being strained.
Right. And as well, there's so many different problems within China, domestically, demographically. A big problem is there's always been this, since the era of Mao, where they sent people out to the countryside, then they brought them, now they're bringing people back in from the countryside. They're trying to expand, they have this doctrine where they want to have, I think, 70% of their population living in cities. And you're talking about these mega cities. Beijing is a first-tier city, and it's over 20 million. Their second and third-tier cities, their third-tier cities are larger than Chicago. I mean,
environmental problems, things they traditionally haven't invested in, they're going to have to invest in. And all that's going to come out of the same, shall we say, money pot. So I'm one who thinks they're a mature economy now. You get rapid growth out of a new economy, but a mature economy, not so fast. Wages go up, other things require investment, and here we are.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this week, but we will continue this discussion at a later date. I'm Hillary Weinberg, your host for The Whole Gamut. This was Carl Schuster, who we're so happy to have on again, and we'll see you next week.
Indeed.